All right, today we're talking about displaying categorical data such as like bar graphs and pie graphs. So in this lesson, we're going to be able to make and interpret bar charts of categorical data, interpret pie charts, identify what makes some graphs of categorical data deceptive. So the vocab includes bar charts and pie charts. All right, so recall that in the last lesson, we talked about frequency tables or relative frequency tables, and we discussed that they can be used to summarize a variable's distribution with numbers. So take a look at the following example by the U.S. Census Bureau on a current population survey. So in this example, this is known as a relative frequency table involving the various levels of education. It's a relative frequency table because notice the proportions or percents on the right-hand side. So this is a relative frequency table which summarizes the distribution. Now we can display this with a bar chart or a pie chart. Now this can be used for categorical data. And notice that the level of education is considered categorical because we're dealing with various categories: less than high school education, education, etc. So we have a bar chart or a pie chart. So in order to be able to use this to display categorical data. So let's look at the definitions for the charts. So a bar chart shows each category as a bar. The heights of the bars show the category frequencies or relative frequencies. A pie chart shows each category as a slice of the pie, and the areas of the slices are proportional to the category frequencies or the relative frequencies. We generally use relative frequencies or percents when we're dealing with pie charts. So in this lesson so far, we know what a bar chart or pie chart is, but we want to focus on making a bar chart. So the first step in making a bar chart is to draw and label your axes. So generally you have an X and a Y axis. So you want to put the name of the categorical variable under the horizontal or X axis. Then you want to indicate whether the graph shows the frequency or the relative frequency to the left of the vertical axis or the Y axis. Next you want to scale the axes. So you want to scale it so that so that's equally spaced by an equal set of numbers. So you want to write the names of the categories so that they're equally spaced on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical you want to start at 0, then place tick marks at equal intervals until you exceed the largest frequency for all categories. Then you want to draw the bars above the category names depending on the frequency. So make the bars, it's important to make the bars equal in width and to leave gaps between the bars for any bar chart. Then you want to make the height correspond to the frequency for that category. So let's look at the following example. So this is the preferred status data for 40 students from the previous lesson. Make a bar chart to display the data. So we want to describe what we see when we graph the data. So notice this is the preferred status, the same data set as the last lesson. So what we want to do first is draw and label the axes as such. We want to label the vertical axis, number of students, and the x-axis, the preferred status. So remember that the frequency always goes on the y-axis, and then the categories go on the x-axis. So now we want to scale the axes. So the largest frequency is 21, and so therefore we're going to choose a scale from 0 to 25, and we're going to go by 5s. So we also want to label the categories on the x-axis, so famous, happy, healthy, and rich. And then as we mentioned earlier, we're going to go from 0 to 25 and go by 5s. You can go by any scale that you wish. Just make sure that you at least cover the maximum frequency for the category, which in this case is 21. So now we can go ahead and draw the bars. So we're going to make the bars equal width, and notice that the height for famous is 7, so it's between 5 and 10. For happy, it's 21, so a little bit above 20. Healthy is below 5, so about 4. And rich is 8, so below 10. Alright, so now we're going to be using the same data set, but this time we're going to draw a pie chart. Remember that pie charts generally use relative frequencies or percents. And they can be made by estimating using the percents that we calculate. So remember that to calculate a percent or a relative frequency, we simply take the frequency divided by the total, and then move the decimal place twice or multiply by 100 to convert it to a percent. So let's look at the frequency table from the previous data set and on the previous lesson. So notice that the total is 40 here. So now we're going to make the relative frequency table using the above read formula. So to calculate the relative frequency for famous, we take the frequency of 7 and divide it by the total of 40, and then move the decimal place twice in order to make it into a percent. So repeating these for the rest of the data sets give us the following percentages or frequencies. Now that we know the percents or the relative frequencies, we want to go ahead and start with a pie chart drawing a circle. Now remember that in this circle, the full circle is 100%, and if you cut it into fourths, each of them are worth 25%. So we're going to be using this to help us kind of guesstimate where each category goes. So starting with our circle pie chart, we're going to start with the happy percentage, which is 52.5%. So that means if we want to do happy, that's a little bit over half of the circle. So that's this category, happy. So we know it's a little bit over 50%. All right, so next we want to do rich, which is about 20%. But we know 20% is a little bit less than 25%, so therefore I'm going a little bit before the 25% line, and this will be rich. All right, so next we want to do, let's do healthy. So let's say 10%. So we know that 10% is half of 20%. So that means we're going to draw the line so that it's half of the rich percent, 20%, which is about there. All right, and then the last one has to be the rest of the circle, which is in this case famous. All right, so now we're going to be comparing distributions with bar charts. So another good use of bar charts is that you can color code it to compare different distributions. So you can compare the distribution of a categorical variable in 2 or more groups. When comparing 2 or more groups, use the percents because this actually helps us more properly compare the two distributions. So let's look at an example. So let's say we have a sample of 200 children, 9 through 17, that was selected. The gender of each student was recorded along with the superpower they would most like to have: invisibility, super strength, telepathy, ability to fly, or ability to freeze time. So the two distributions to compare in this case are male versus female. So if we look at the data below, we know that the females coded in green, blue-green, and then the males coded in purple. So we can, and then notice that the percents are displayed on the y-axis. So this helps us correctly compare the two distributions. So from the graph, it seems that females were more likely to choose telepathy than males. And it seems that males are more likely to choose super strength or the ability to freeze time than females. All right, let's look at the good and bad for graphs. So sometimes graphs can be misleading. So bar graphs do not seem interesting as a graph choice. However, you want to beware of actually converting the rectangles or the bars in bar graphs into pictographs. So pictographs uses pictures instead of bars to display the data. So bar graphs allow us to reliably compare quantities if the widths of the bars are identical and can be useful. So there are many ways to make misleading graphs. So for example, if you tamper with the scaling or you use visual deceptions, including but not limited to pictographs. So here's an example. So the students in Mr. Tyson's high school stats class were recently asked if they would prefer a pasta party, pizza party, or a donut party. So the data is provided on the right. So we want to look at the graphs below to determine how they can be misleading. So let's look at the graph on the right. So these are the frequencies for who preferred which type of party. So notice that the donut is the lowest category and pasta is the highest category and pizza is the second highest. If we were to graph this with a pictograph, notice the pictures instead of the bars. Compare that to a bar graph. So where pasta is clearly the highest bar, pizza is the second highest bar, and donut is the smallest. So let's look at the pictograph. So the pictograph actually makes it look like the number of students preferring pizza or donut parties is larger because of the misrepresentation of area. So this is sort of like the area principle, is that our eyes visualize like the width times the area times the height. So our eyes are basically looking at which one is the greatest area, and that can be deceiving in this example. So keep in mind whenever you're using pictographs, beware of using them because they can be visually misleading. Now let's look at the bar graph. So let's look at the pasta compared to the donut bars. So if we were to stack the amount of donuts, the amount of bars for the donut and compare it to the pasta, there are a lot of bars for the donut that can fit alongside of the pasta. So this is a little bit deceiving because it shows that the donut bar is actually 14 times smaller than the pasta. In other words, it's showing that the pasta is 14 times larger than the donut category. But we know this can't be true because the pasta category is only about 4 times larger when you compare the numbers, because 5 times 4 is about 20. So it's a little bit less than 4 times larger. But on the graph, it appears 14 times larger. So this is actually visually deceiving as well. And this is because the bar graph started the scale at 4 instead of the normal 0. So it looks like the number of students who preferred a pasta party is over 10 times larger than that of a donut, which is actually not true. So go ahead and pause the video and try this following problem as it relates to graphs. Alright, so we got the Pew Research Center asked a random sample of 2024 adult cell phone owners from the United States which type of cell phone they own: iPhone, Android, and other, including non-smartphones. So these are probably like the brick phones or the flip phones that maybe older adults may have. So the frequency table below shows the results of the survey. So we want to make a bar graph to display the distribution of phone owners and then describe what we see. And then we want to basically compare the graphs and make statements about the graphs. So let's start with the first one. So we got the graph above, or the frequency distribution above. Now remember, the first step is to draw and to label the axes. So we're going to start labeling the x and the y-axis. So remember that the x-axis involves the categories, in this case the type of cell phone. The y-axis involves the frequencies. So now we want to scale the axes. So we know that the largest frequency is 1054. So let's choose a vertical scale. Let's label the x-axis iPhone, Android, and other. And then let's label the y-axis. Let's go by 250 on the y-axis. You can choose any scale that you want. Just make sure that you're using the same scale throughout. So let's draw the bars now. So the iPhone category, we know that iPhones are 467 people, so that's below 500. Android is a little bit above 500, and other is a little bit above 1,000. Now let's look at the second one. So we have the chart, and it's broken down by categories. So we want to compare the distributions based off of age categories. So here are some examples of some responses that you may add. So in this example, the green bar represents the adults age over the age of 55. So it seems that the adults over the age of 55 are more likely to own phones other than the iPhone or Android. So these guys are more likely to own maybe the older type generation phones, maybe the brick phones, maybe the flip phones. You could also say that the adults of age 18 to 34 are more likely to own Androids than any other age group, according to the graph. So there are different interpretations of this graph, and these are just some of the examples. All right, so let's summarize the following lessons. So we talked about frequency, we mentioned frequency tables that are used for summarizing a distribution of numbers. We mentioned that we can represent categorical data with bar charts or pie charts. So remember, categorical data does not involve the use of numbers at all. It only involves the use of labels or groups. We discussed how to make bar charts and the 3 steps for that. We discussed an example of making a pie chart and how to go about calculating the percents and making the graph. And we discussed how to use bar charts to compare 2 or more distributions or groups based off of color coding. Then we discussed how we can mislead others using pictographs and issues with scaling in order to make others misinterpret the data. All right, next up we're going to be talking about quantitative data, beginning with displaying dot plots.